Remember to accept the recording notice in your screen. And let me move a few things here. So we are doing the second study on this series, Remember This. I wanted to do a set of different studies that they're not related with each other per se, except for the fact that there are topics that I did want to touch based on the ministry that we've been sharing for these 18 years to just encourage you to remember important things that will make a difference as we continue serving the Lord, even if we serve in different places in the globe. Last Sunday we started this study, and today we are going to be talking about a different topic altogether. Last week we talked about beware of resentfulness and how it connects with spiritual oppression, and the importance of learning how to forgive and what forgiveness looks like. So take resentfulness seriously as a door of spiritual oppression that we have to keep closed. That will make a big difference in your life. Today we're going to be studying a different topic, which I call this Remember Your Citizenship. During the past years here in the US, in the context in which we are, and now currently with the pandemic in which we are facing all these unexpected turns, I see an increase of potential for tensions and divisions and struggles in our own lives and families and churches if we forget our citizenship. And especially as a ministry that is serving in a multicultural context with a vision that is a vision of being transcultural and multi-generational, and all these things that are very important to our hearts. None of these things will be able to survive the time and the time we're in if we fail to remember our citizenship. So we are going to look at 3 key passages in this study, and we will look at the implications as well. So we will start first with taking a look at the book of Acts, because there's a moment in the life of the Apostle Paul where citizenship became part of the topic. And as it turned out, it was a very important part of the topic. So let's take a look at the book of Acts, and we're going to ask this important question first. How important was citizenship in the time of the Apostle Paul, and why? Okay, so Kim Dingus, are you there and can you hear us?
Yes.
Would you please read this section from Acts 22, but also remember the question that we are asking as we read, okay? So read this out loud for us, and then we will look into it.
Acts 22, starting at verse 25. Excuse me. As they stretched out him to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen."
In the next section.
The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains.
Okay, and that's the end of the section. Are you familiar with what's going on here? What is the background of what's happening? Where is Paul and why is this happening to him?
I, I don't remember exactly. I assume he would have been preaching, and he was causing a commotion, and so they arrested him.
Yeah. So this is the time where he went to Jerusalem to do the Nazarite vow, and then
Oh,
he had taken a couple of guys with him to the temple, and the Jews in the temple thought that they were Gentiles
yeah.
from Asia, and then that caused the uproar, and they wanted to kill him. And then the army came and took Paul from the crowd,
Right.
and that's what's going on at that moment. So, in the midst of the whole commotion, what do we read? What is the topic of this conversation? What do you get from it?
Well, they were about to flog him because he was causing just such a commotion. But then once they actually realized he was a Roman citizen, they had second thoughts because they had special rights for citizenship of Rome.
So the fact that you either had it or didn't have it changed how people treated you. And so you can see that there was a very clear distinction in the Roman mindset about categorizing people. And this was a very strong way of categorizing people, just like the Jews would categorize people always between Gentiles and Jews. For the Romans, the categorization that was predominant was you're either a citizen or you are not. And if you were a citizen, what you get from the conversation that the centurion has with Paul is that there was more than one way to get the citizenship, right? What were the two ways that we learned here?
Yeah, you could be born a citizen, or you could also pay to become a citizen.
Yeah, and pay a lot of money to become a citizen, right? So we know that Paul was born in Tarsus, which was the capital of a region under Roman rule, but it was a free area. So people born in Tarsus were given citizenship. So we don't know more details about who his parents were or anything, but we know from here that he was born a Roman citizen. So he had a very huge privilege in that way. But we also know that the centurion, even though he was serving the Romans, he himself didn't have the citizenship by birth. He had to buy it. What changed in the way they treated Paul after they learned that he was a Roman citizen?
Yeah, they didn't want to treat him harshly because they might be treated harshly themselves once it was found out that he was a Roman citizen, and maybe he filed some complaint or something.
Mm-hmm. So they were getting into kind of legal territory that was complicated. So they were in big trouble if they mistreated the guy. So we can at least deduce from this passage that having citizenship came with certain protections or certain rights that not having it didn't, you couldn't have. So how important then, the question we were asking, how important, let me actually go back so we can see the question. How important was citizenship in the time of the Apostle Paul, and why? So how would you answer that question based on what we just read?
Well, it was very important. You received certain special rights because you were a citizen. You were given legal rights. You'd have to go through a trial, I would assume, and being found guilty of something in order to be imprisoned.
Yeah. So remember that there was a time in which later, throughout this period of his life, he ended up appealing to Caesar. And when he realized he was in the midst of all these corruption about his case, he decided to appeal to Caesar. So which meant, as a Roman citizen, he can go and take his case to the very emperor. So there were very important rights that it came with the citizenship. So when the Apostle Paul uses the word citizenship, it's a very heavy word, because in their context, citizenship was Roman citizenship. You know, that was the thing. And it was so pricey and precious that if you could get it by paying a lot of money, then you wanted to get it. Right? So it came with the whole package of legal rights and certain protections. So thank you, Ken, for reading that section for us. So the first thing that we learned is that the Apostle Paul knew what it was like to have the citizenship, and a very precious one. And he knew how the citizenship brought him certain rights and protections, so he was able to play it, you know, for his benefit, like in this situation we just read. Now, do we live in a context? And Ken, I ask you that question again to you before you go. Do we live in a context in which citizenship matters?
You're you're referring to today?
Yeah, the context in which we live today.
Yes. The citizenship is still very important. You're able to vote because you're a citizen. Able to get a American passport, allows you to travel because you're a citizen.
So, and is the American citizenship something that is highly priced?
Yes, it is.
It is, right? It comes with some benefits and privileges. Do you know if some people pay a lot of money to be able to get it?
I imagine they do.
Yeah, some people do, especially if they try to do it the crooked way. But you have it by birth. If you're born here, you have it. But if you're not born here and you want to get it, then it's not an easy process. It takes time and years and perhaps lawyers and different things. So do we also categorize people between those who are citizens and those who are not?
Yeah, I imagine somewhat.
Right. So even for job applications, I read sometimes where they say the person has to be either a citizen or have legal permits to work here, you know, and things like that, right? So we definitely are aware of those categorizations, and then for those that come here without the legal process of permits and stuff, we have the label illegal, right? An illegal immigrant, as people label it. So you can see certain parallels with the experience of the Apostle Paul, where he was, how citizenship as a concept and as a tangible reality, not just a label, but a tangible reality that had, you know, that made a difference. How important it was. So we can kind of identify certain parallels, even though we are very different societies and separated by time. But with this context, therefore, we can then better understand what the Apostle Paul will do when he touches on this topic and develops it forward. So thank you, Ken, for engaging with me on this. The second question then we're going to ask is going to be this: what is Paul's warning to the Philippians? Because the Philippians were a group of Christians that were very close to his heart. you might remember that actually when he started preaching the gospel in Philippi, he also ended up in prison and ended up with kind of a crowd and uproar and trouble, you know. And when was that? What was that trouble about? Do you remember? Anybody?
It cast a demon out of a girl who was saying in the marketplace that she knew about the God that he preached about, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So when
And spirit out of her, and then her handlers could not continue to earn money by her fortune telling.
yeah, so they caused the uproar, and they wanted to get rid of this Paul, his companion, and then they both ended up in prison, and then that resulted in the conversion of the jailer, his family, right, and also Lydia, the businesswoman that came to know the Lord. So he had a very close relationship with the Philippians. What do we know? And Peggy, since you are engaging with me, let's continue together then here. What do we know about the city of Philippi? Do you know anything else about the background of Philippi? And actually, in your trip to the Holy Land, were you able to learn any more tangible things about Philippi, even though it's a Greek city?
No, we did not go to Philippi at all. Let's see. The question was, what else do I know about the story?
About the city of Philippi.
About the city. Well, it was an important city. It was the first city in Europe that Paul went to, I believe, and because God had given him a dream in over in Troas that someone from Macedonia was saying, come over to Macedonia. Yeah. And Paul had been prevented from going to other places in Asia Minor to preach. And this was his direction to go then to Europe. And as you said, Lydia, you mentioned Lydia, she was the first convert to Christianity there in Philippi.
Yeah, and so this city was in the region of Macedonia, and a couple of other things that we know about that the Bible doesn't specifically say is that this city was a Roman colony, and because it was a Roman colony, it had the same privilege that Tarsus, where Paul was from, had. They were a city that you could, if you were born there, you had Roman citizenship. So then Paul is talking to people that have a very similar experience as his, in the fact of, hey, you are born here, you have Roman citizenship, and we have that privilege. So it was a place that in the cultural context had that that important treasure of, hey, we are Roman citizens here, you know, in contrast to other areas in the surrounding area to Philippi that were not Roman colonies, therefore they didn't have that status, right? So they had a political stand and status that was special. We are Roman citizens as well. So with that in mind, Peggy, would you read what Paul writes to these Philippians in this section? It's a warning. So what is the warning? Again, the question will be, what is Paul's warning to the Philippians, right? So here we go.
Philippians 3, verse 17. Join together in following my example, brothers and sisters, and just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. For as I have often told you before, And now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction. Their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things.
Okay, so you just read a very detailed description of the warning. What do you get as you read this? What is his tone, his attitude about the warning, and what is the warning about?
Well, he's talking to people that he knows very well. And they know how he lived amongst them. And he's asking them to keep that model and continue living as he did, that they should avoid those things that are not helpful for the gospel, because many do, and they are enemies of the cross. And then he says their destruction is their destiny. They will be destroyed. And because the last line, their mind is set on earthly things. Mm-hmm. So the opposite of that is, and we know the next verse coming pretty much, but do not concentrate on earthly things. Concentrate on your citizenship in heaven.
Right. Yeah, and we will get to that section in a second. So what was amazing here is that he says, look, I'm going to tell you something, even with tears. I mean, this is so like a very close subject to his heart. He's saying, please live like me, not like them. And the separation between the me and them is very much linked to their perspective, right? The them, they live with a mindset on earthly things, and therefore, what do they live for? Well, their God says their stomach. They live to just eat and taste and have, experience these things, and their glory is their shame, which means that the things that they glory on are shameful. The things that they value as, hey, look what I'm doing, are, shameful things, because they are set on earthly, worldly things. Don't live like them. He says, don't be like that. Instead, be like me. So the be like me is going to come in the following verses. So what we know is that he basically says, you have an option. You either live like them, which have their mindsets on earthly things, and therefore emphasize the superfluous, or you live like me. And what is that? So let's read the following section, Peggy.
Verse 20, but our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body.
Mm-hmm. So now this is the section you were anticipating that was coming, right? So what is beautiful about this description?
Our citizenship is in heaven, which we are not there yet. And so we are living eagerly waiting for that, because we know that the Lord Jesus Christ will bring it about, that we will be there with him. Mm-hmm. And that he has the power to do this. And everything that is happening here is still under his control, and eventually all of it will be changed, because he'll be in complete control. And we will be transformed so that we will be changed to have a body like his.
Yeah.
Glorious body.
Yeah,
Eternal.
with the glorification of our bodies, right?
Mhm.
And that's what we are waiting. What's interesting is that he doesn't say our citizenship will be in heaven, but he says our citizenship is in heaven. And that's where he sets the foundation that contrasts how he lives with the first group he just described, that their minds is on earthly things. He says, my mind is not on earthly things, because I know where my citizenship is. I'm a citizen of heaven. So the way the Apostle Paul sees himself, I find it striking, especially in the context of what we were just talking about. I mean, he's talking to Roman citizens, right? So when he's telling them, as a Roman citizen himself, look, guys, I know we have Roman citizenship, but our citizenship is in heaven. See, so he is, in that statement, is really a statement of contrast, priority. It is true that we have this citizenship here, but that is not what defines us. What defines us is our citizenship in heaven. And let me tell you, this is what we're waiting, right? The glorification of our body. The Lord Jesus will come back. Everything is going to change. So I love this section because it expresses his heart. He is eagerly awaiting the Savior. So as he is experiencing all these things he's experiencing, he does it with this perspective of he knows where he's going, he knows where he belongs. And this is where I find a very interesting contrast, Peggy, here, because our citizenship is based on where we are from, but our heavenly citizenship is based on where we are going. So our destiny determines our citizenship, from the spiritual perspective. So now everything changes, because here he says, look, I want you to be thinking of yourselves as citizens of heaven. And I'm telling you this with tears, okay? So I'm telling you this with tears. Don't live like them, but live like me. They live for earthly things. I live as a citizen of heaven, eagerly awaiting the Lord, and that's what I'm living for. So this is what we call eternal perspective, right? So let's go back to after we read this section. What is Paul's warning to the Philippians, therefore? How would you answer that question?
Avoid living like others in the world. Instead, live like it is in heaven. In other words, love, doing good, etc., because of the love of God.
Right.
And to me, it kind of connects with in the Gospels where Jesus said, they will know you by your love. So we don't have a document of citizenship in heaven necessarily, but when we are practicing our citizenship in heaven, they'll know us.
Yeah. There's a way of life that will characterize people that really think of themselves as citizens of heaven. And here is where the concept of citizenship becomes so important, because what I see today, and this is why I am bringing this topic to the table of remember your citizenship, is because I'm afraid that too many Christians are emphasizing their earthly identity in political terms and persuasions and preferences so loudly that they are overshadowing their true eternal citizenship. And therefore, rather than living as citizens of heaven, is their earthly citizenship that is the loudest and biggest identity that they carry with them. And when we do that, we unavoidably fall into the position of dividing people, categorizing them, and demonizing those that are opposite or different from. And our ability to love, as you were saying, Peggy, love them as a citizen of heaven, our ability to love them is completely compromised because our earthly identity becomes so strong that we cannot live with our mind on earthly things and our mind on heavenly things at the same time. One has priority over the other. So there are so many churches that you walk in and the environment is a political environment. They don't intend so. They don't do that intentionally. But that's what they have created. And what we want as a ministry is to be true to our citizenship in heaven. Is that when people walk into our family of ethnos, whether I am the pastor leading or somebody else is leading, that when people walk into the family of ethnos, they walk into an embassy of heaven on earth. That has to remain the flavor of who we are. When that is no longer the flavor, we are no longer an embassy of heaven on earth, then we have set our heart on earthly, temporary things. And that has hijacked our primary source of identity, which is Christ. So we see here, therefore, that the Apostle Paul brings this up, and it's not going to be the only time, because throughout his letters, when he talks about, look, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, because we're one in Christ. Whenever he's emphasizing all those passages in Galatians and Colossians, he is trying to remind people, look, we are from heaven. And this is how we people from heaven operate. It's a whole different identity that doesn't categorize and therefore treat people based on those categories. So after understanding how he takes the concept of citizenship that people were so familiar with on earthly terms, but then he takes it to the next level to say, look, we are citizens of heaven, and this is how we need to live. Then I want to ask one more question in the study that will lead us to the conclusion. And this is, what characterizes the attitude of servants devoted to God when it comes to this topic? What does God think about it? Historically, what has characterized the attitude of servants devoted to God when it comes to this topic? So for that, we are going to read the book of Hebrews. And Andrea, are you still there? Can you hear us, and are you able to read these things for us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so we're going to read the book of Hebrews. I'm going to ask you to read starting on verse 13. We're going to have two slides that we're going to be reading. So you can start on verse 13.
Okay. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth.
And before we keep going, so you see Hebrews 11, you start verse 13, and it's talking about all these people. Are you familiar with any of the background of who he's talking about here?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so Hebrews 11, anytime you see that combination, Hebrews 1:1, okay, 11 right here, that is the Hall of Fame for those that have walked by faith. This is the chapter, the famous chapter of faith. This is the chapter where where the author says, and I said the author because we don't really know for sure who wrote Hebrews, but here he says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Here's where he says faith is, he defines it for us. So then he starts talking about the heroes of the faith, and he names Abraham, and then he names a bunch of other guys from the Old Testament, right? So this is Hebrews 11, is the chapter about faith and the heroes of the faith. So with that little clarification now, Andrea, what does he say about these heroes of the faith?
He says, well, it kind of helps me understand whenever he said they didn't receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. I think it makes me think of like Abraham and people, right? Of where they were faithful to the Lord and believed in his promises, even though they didn't receive them, right? Like in their lifetime, essentially on earth.
Right. Like for instance, Abraham, he was promised that his descendants were going to be as numerous as the stars, or the sand. And how many of those did he get to see? Well, he got to see the one son, Isaac, right? So what about the rest of the multitude of descendants? Well, he didn't receive that. He didn't get to see it. He just welcomed it by faith, believing that what God said was going to happen. So he welcomed it from the distance, right? So there are promises like that are going to happen. And now you look back and we have the nation of Israel, we have the Jews, we have all these things that when Abraham was given the promise, they were not there yet. Right? And then we had the Messiah that did come, that did bring the salvation to all the nations of the earth. We're going to be blessed through him. So all these things now came true. However, for Abraham, when those promises were given, he only saw just a little tiny bit of it, kind of like the top of the iceberg. He didn't get to see the whole iceberg. But it not only tells us what was their experience, but there was a mindset that characterized people like Abraham, a way of identity, how they saw themselves. What do we learn from this passage about that?
I think Pablo has just been disconnected, so I'm sure he'll come back in. I was the second one in, so I am now the host. You may take 3 breaths before our pastor shows back up. And that was George talking. Okay, Ken, are you going to start preaching? Your name came up.
No, I was looking there. Sarah, do you need to go check on him? I think.
It's nice and convenient. She'd be right around the corner. I wonder if he was still preaching, didn't even know we got cut off.
He'll eventually determine that. So, okay, well, what was the question? Andrea, you get a chance. You get to recreate the question and then give your answer.
I was laughing because I kept talking that I didn't realize it was on mute. I'm trying to remember the question now. What did, like, their view of themselves, like what? I don't remember his question.
I'm back here. I'm back. Sorry for the technical issue here, but let me go back to share the screen. So Andrea, you were talking about the way they experience life, that they welcome things from the distance, they didn't receive all the promises, right? But in addition to their experience, it tells us how they saw themselves. It tells us an issue of identity.
Mhm.
What is that?
What is identity?
No, I mean, how do they see themselves? All these heroes of the faith.
Oh, man, how do they see themselves? I think to me, their identity is rooted and very based on like, I think their trust in who God is. And I think that then shapes who they are. I don't know if that's like the right way to answer the question, but
Okay, so I'm going to do this. Read the passage one more time and see if that clicks. Read it out loud for us one more time.
okay, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Oh, the second part. They saw themselves as foreigners and strangers on earth.
Right, so the verse tells us the answer, right? So I was not trying to trick you with a hard question here, but what do you think that implies? That they admitted that they were foreigners and strangers on earth, because in reality they were not. I mean, Abram was from Ur of the Chaldeans, that's where he was from, and then he moved out of there, and then his descendants, had an identity as a nation, and they had their location and the place where they grew and everything. So they did have a place, right, and an identity that was earthly. But here it says, however, they admitted that in reality they were foreigners and strangers on earth. So you see now, their behavior is determined by their identity, how they're thinking of themselves. And then, so that we won't have to leave it for a guess, actually the rest of the verse tells us a little bit more in detail what this meant, that they saw themselves as foreigners and strangers on earth. So let's take a look at it, and you can read it out loud for us.
Okay. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
So what did it mean that they saw themselves as foreigners and strangers on earth? What were they looking for? What was they were longing for?
The heavenly home that's eternal.
And you see how he calls it a country and a city? It's like it's really a community of people with structures and things that are just not from this earth. And they were not focused on their earthly identity or the country they were from. They were focused on the country they were going to. And not only they were going to for that country, but it says in verse 16, they were looking for a better country. They knew that this one was even better by far compared to the one they were from. So here is where I start seeing everything that Apostle Paul is mentioning about, look, our citizen is in heaven. Let's live like citizens of heaven. Let's not act like those other people that are set on earthly things. And all of these things simply are not just from Paul. Hebrews says, people that have walked by faith, servants devoted to God, as we call us, are people that have been characterized by this mindset for centuries. They live on the earth. They do have an earthly identity, but the identity that really drives them and shapes them is their heavenly one, because they know that longing for that better country that they're going to. Do you see that mindset how so strongly here, Andrea? Andrea, you have more than one citizenship, is that correct?
Yes.
What are the citizenships that you have?
United States and El Salvador.
Okay, so you have Salvadorian and American citizenship. And so you can identify with how citizenship plays a role in how we experience life, or how we identify or live. Here, in addition to citizenship, it talks about the place itself, the country itself that we're going to. And now here is the contrast. This is how I want to put it. Part of what I see, which is part of my concern, is that there are some Christians that live so driven by their earthly identity and earthly citizenship that they live with one goal, and that is to make this country a Christian nation, or go back to being a Christian nation as they perceived it to be. And that's their mission. And that's how permeate everything that they do. And yet here, it says that the heroes of the faith lived longing for a better country. And they were not emphasizing the earthly one, otherwise they would have returned to it and settled there. There's a lack of permanence. There's a transient part of the way people saw life and engaged with this dual dimension. They do not abandon or become indifferent to their earthly citizenship, but they let their heavenly citizenship be the one that drives them, that shapes them, that affects the way they speak and interact with others. This mindset has characterized heroes of the faith and people that walk with the Lord for ages. Now, one more question, Andrea, about the text, and the answer is in the text, okay? Just heads up. How does God feel about that?
How does what? Sorry.
How does God feel about them? Those people that live like that and have that mindset, how does he feel about it?
The longing for the heavenly one. It says, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
Yeah. It's like if your father came to you, Andrea, and said, Andrea, I'm not ashamed to be called your father. What does that mean?
What does that mean? That he
Yeah.
loves me and he's not ashamed of me.
Yeah, it's like it's another way of saying I'm proud of you. And I say, you're my girl. I'm so proud of you. Look at what you have become. And God is saying to these Christians that live like citizens of heaven, that admit, I'm just a foreigner on earth. I'm passing by. You know what he says of them? He says, I'm proud of you. I'm not ashamed of being called your God. You're exactly the kind of person that I want my children to be. People that live on earth as citizens of heaven and that are willing to pursue my purposes with everything they've got because they know where they're going. That is a servant devoted to God. That is what I want to be. And that's what I hope our Ethnos family can continue to be. Thank you, Andrea, for engaging with me on this section. So now you know more about Hebrews 11, and now you know what the passage is talking about. So I want to share with you a beautiful quote that I discovered in my doctoral dissertation studies. That was a quote that somebody wrote in a letter. And this letter was describing these Christians that were popping up in different places of the Roman Empire. And these Christians had some kind of just thing about them, how they lived, and they were different from the other citizens or people. So look at what the description of these Christians of the 2nd century, and we are talking about just years after the Apostle John died. So we're talking about that period of time. And look at what it says. But while dwelling in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot is cast, and adhering to the local customs in both dress and diet and the rest of life, they show forth the remarkable and confessedly paradoxical character of their own citizenship. They live in their own homelands, but as resident aliens. They participate in all things as citizens, but endure all things as strangers. Every foreign country is their homeland, but every homeland is a foreign country. Isn't that beautiful or what? It's like that somebody was able to notice this in such a poetic way of these Christians of the 2nd century is remarkable. So the question that remains then for you and me, when people meet you, who are they going to meet? When people talk to you, who are they going to hear? Is it going to be the experience of meeting a citizen of heaven that is a foreign on earth? That, yeah, is an American citizen, but sounds very different from those Americans that are very earthly. Are you going to be one that has his mindset on the heavenly things, where every foreign country is your homeland, but your homeland is a foreign country? Is this who are we going to be? Or going to be the Christian that is so political that becomes divisive and people prefer to avoid because you are so self-righteous and demonize everybody else that doesn't think like you? That's why I want to simply say, live as citizens of heaven. Let's make sure that we don't forget this, that as we live and as we serve, ethnos for the years to come will never cease to be an embassy of heaven on earth. Amen? So as we conclude this study, these are the questions that I have. 2 specific questions that I want us to reflect about. First one, based on your experience, what is one obstacle that can keep us from living as Heavenians? And secondly, what can happen if we stop living as Heavenians? Okay, so this is focusing on the outcome of us failing to remember this, right? If we do not live as citizens of heaven, then what's going to happen? So what's an obstacle that can keep us from having that perspective that the Apostle Paul has? And what will the outcome be if we live that way on earthly things instead of being heavenly? Because those are the 2 questions. So you have them? Will you remember them? What can keep you from living as a citizen of heaven? And what will the outcome be if you don't live as a citizen of heaven? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to spend just the next 5 minutes. That's it. You're going to be in a random group and you're going to share your thought. Well, I think that what keeps me from being a citizen of heaven or living like that or being aware of that in my life is this. And so what comes to mind? So here we go. Quick share. I want to stop the share of the screen. I'm going to do the groups and I'm going to end the recording here, by the way. So here we go.